Of all cryptid creatures, I think that skinwalkers scare me the most. Something about the way that they use your mother's voice or your dog's bark to lure you into the woods, to me, is like the creepiest thing ever. And what happens to the people who do get lured into the woods by those familiar sounds? I have no idea. But I do know I do not want to find out. Marie writes in, she and some co-workers had a bonfire out in the woods. And it wasn't huge. There was only 7 or 8 people there, and she knew most of them. And so for the first hour, it was super fun. They were about a mile away from civilization. And it was in rural Utah. So there are not many cars going around. There's not much traffic if you did need help. And out of the whole group, there really was only one person that she didn't know. But she didn't think anything of it. She just thought that they were a friend of one of her coworkers. He was a tall, skinny white dude with black hair and blue eyes. And she noticed that he was kind of distant. He didn't talk a whole lot to too many people. He was very reserved. But she didn't think too much of that because she figured if she's a friend of a coworker, that kind of behavior would be expected. But as time went on, she noticed that he would kind of randomly stare at people. And that's when he kind of started to feel a little off to her. But before she started asking anybody who he was, she started to just watch him a little closer. The way that he moved was really strange. The way that he walked was kind of strange. The way that he moved his body and his head was kind of weird. And this kind of made her paranoid. So she started asking her coworkers if they knew this guy. And one by one, she would ask them, and they would say, no, I thought he was with somebody else. And once she figured out that none of her coworkers were with this guy, she figures that is enough. She went around to each coworker then, told them what was happening, said, this guy's not with anybody. We need to get out of here. And all of her coworkers agreed. So they all agreed to pack up and go back to Marie's house instead. So they all packed up their stuff, pretending that they were calling it quits for the night, saying goodbye to each other, and packed everything up in the cars. And this guy didn't get into any car. He just stood near the woods and waved goodbye. And as she drove off, she's in the car with a colleague of hers who's also her friend. And they look back and the guy had disappeared, like in an instant. And if that wasn't creepy enough, Marie had just had one of the windows in her car broken out, so she could hear everything going on around her. And on their way out of the woods, every now and then, she could swear she heard screaming or somebody calling her name. And that just made her and her friend terrified. They just kept hearing these noises, like a horse neigh or a dog whine or somebody calling their name or screaming or wolves howling. And something just told Marie that whatever it is was making these noises to lure her into the woods. But luckily, nobody in her party of coworkers took the bait. As they're leaving the gravel road, getting ready to turn onto the main road, Marie's car is last. So she's got a really good view of everything happening behind her. And from her rear view mirror, she sees someone run across the road way faster than any human being should be able to run. And it was tall, skinny, and super pale. And it freaked her out so bad at that point that she just gunned it on the road and passed all of her coworkers. And her friend in the passenger seat asked her what was wrong, but she was just so terrified she couldn't speak. All she could do was pay attention to the road and drive. And at one point, she almost drove off the road into the woods. And she finally snapped out of it when another coworker called her and asked her what was going on. So she, of course, lied and said everything was fine. And he, of course, didn't believe her and kept goading her to tell him what was wrong. But she just kept saying, nope, everything is fine, until he gave up and finally said, fine, we'll meet you back at your house. And now Marie says she is terrified to go near any woods, or sometimes even just to leave her house. And she thinks that if her instincts had not kicked in and told her to leave and get everyone else out of there, someone at that bonfire would never have been heard from again. Now, as some of you might already know, many Navajo people are reluctant to talk about skinwalkers. They believe if you talk about them, you will draw their attention. Well, Rick, however, did not grow up on the Navajo reservation. He grew up away from it, and so was very naive on the subject. And when it came to skinwalkers, he was a skeptic. His mom used to tell a story of how back in the 80s, when she lived with her siblings and his grandparents, how she and her sister saw one on the driveway under a streetlight. And she describes it as a big black dog with dirty fur and a twisted noodle-like front leg and these unnatural eyes with a soft burnt orange glow. And Rick, being his close-minded self, doubted every word, although he never told his mother that. But those doubts changed last year when he went to visit his grandparents in October. He and his family had just finished scourging the carnival at the Navajo Nation Fair and were calling it a night. Now, their house was close enough that they could walk home in like 10 minutes. So they did. And it was probably about 9 o'clock when they got home. And they all stayed up until like 2 a.m., just catching up on family matters and local news. And it was during that time that Rick decided to open his mouth and blurt out the question, "Hey, are skinwalkers real?" "Guys, you shouldn't be asking about that," his grandmother said with a scold in her voice. And at that point, both she and his grandfather decided it was time for bed. And after being quietly scolded by his mom, one of his aunts chimes in with a very cautious tone and says, "Yes, they are real, all right. We had a few screaming outside of our trailer a few nights ago. Your cousin had nightmares all night and woke up crying in the morning." Not wanting to push the point any further, they all decided to just go to bed. Now, the trailer that was their home was pretty old, didn't have air conditioning, so they were all sleeping with the windows open and just with the screens so the breeze could come through. And everyone had drifted off to sleep except Rick. His mind was going a million miles a minute thinking about skinwalkers, and he started to wonder, I wonder, now that I'm on the reservation, if maybe I might see one. And that is when the hit the fan. Just as Rick was settling down, relaxing, and almost ready to fall asleep, he started to hear something moving outside. So he got up off the couch and wandered over to the kitchen window. And all the lights were off inside the trailer. The only light around was from the porch light out in front. And Rick was actually thinking he was kind of glad that that was the case, because if there was a skinwalker out there, maybe it wouldn't notice him looking at it. So he finally musters up the courage to take a look out the window. And all he sees are the cars in the driveway and the trash cans on the side of the road. And after about a good 5 seconds of scanning the area, he doesn't see anything. He turns around and he starts going back to bed, thinking it was probably just a stray cat or something. And he only gets about 2 steps when he hears this distorted screaming from outside, coming from someplace definitely close. And Rick pushes past the fear that's rising in his stomach and looks out the window again, and he sees it. A coyote-like figure is staring in his direction from behind the cars, just out of reach of the porch light. Only it looked really wrong and gave off a really evil vibe just looking at it. It was gray with very disheveled hair and an evil dark orange glow coming from its eyes. So Rick says, "I don't think so," and runs back to the bedroom. And at this point, he notices an awful stench of rotting meat filling the trailer. So Rick starts trying to wake up his mom. And his mom's like, "Ugh, it is 3 a.m. What do you want? And Rick tells her in a shaky voice, there's something scary outside. And his mom says, still trying to go back to sleep, it's the res. There are animals wandering all the time. It's just a stray cat or something. And Rick is thinking, she is obviously not getting the drift of what it is I am trying to say. So he screams, there is some Blair Witch Project going on outside, Ma. That got her attention. And his mom says, what? What the hell are you talking about? And just then, they both heard it. The unnatural screaming coming from outside, as well as what sounded like something thrashing around on the ground. Rick says, hear that? That's what I'm talking about. So both Rick and his mom got up and made their way back to that kitchen window. And they looked outside, and sure enough, that coyote thing was making its way toward the front door. And it walked with an odd limp, and it dragged one of its back legs like it was handicapped. And they could hear it start to scratch on the front door as it's making this odd, muffled moaning sound. So Rick's mom went and got Rick's dad, and they both start yelling at this thing in Navajo, telling it to go away, that it's not welcome here. Well, all this commotion is enough to wake up everyone, and they all start coming out into the hallway. And his mom looks at everyone and says, Skinwalker, as she's pointing to the window. But apparently, they already knew what to do, as his grandfather comes out, grabs his handgun, gets a bag of ashes out of the kitchen drawer, coats the bullets in ashes, and loads them back into the gun. Then he marches straight to the front door, whips it open, yelling something in Navajo so fast that Rick couldn't quite understand, and fires 2 shots into the dark. But nothing. The thing managed to escape before Rick's grandpa could shoot it. And the only thing his grandpa said was, that's the fastest one I've ever seen. And the next thing you know, Rick's aunts and his parents are all freaking out and saying things like, what if it comes back tomorrow? And it saw us. Does that mean that we're all targets now? But his grandparents calmed everybody down and got everybody back to bed. The next morning, Rick's grandparents called one of the neighbors and explained to them everything that had happened. Apparently, one of their neighbors was a medicine man who used to partake in ceremonies of healing and curing sickness. And he came over and gave each member of the family a blessing and blessed the grounds outside the house. And Rick is no longer a skeptic. This story comes from Joe, who explains that this is actually not his story, but it's his father's story, from when his father was a little boy of 11 or 12 years old. Now, his father, Ed, lived in a really small house. It was just his parents and him and his 2 brothers. One night, Ed's parents had gone to Jamie's feast with some other people, leaving the 3 boys home alone to tend the sheep. So that night, as the boys are getting ready for bed, the dogs start going crazy outside. But they just thought it was some coyotes or something, so they just told the dogs to be quiet. And as they're trying to drift off to sleep, the dogs still are howling outside, so the kids are just telling them to shut up. And they finally do fall asleep for a while. But when Ed woke up a few hours later, everything was quiet. All he could hear was the breathing and the snoring of his brothers. But Ed needed to use the outhouse, so he woke up one of his brothers to take him there. And his brother was teasing him about being scared to go out there by himself. And Ed was scared to go out there by himself. So both boys get up, his brother grabs a flashlight, and they go outside to the outhouse. And once again, the dogs start going crazy, and they're bounding all over the place outside, running around in the sagebrush. And his brother says he's going to use the outhouse first. So his brother goes in, and Ed is just standing outside waiting for him. So while he's waiting, Ed is trying to follow one of the dogs with the flashlight. And suddenly, there's this super loud whine from one of the dogs. Everything went quiet. Too quiet for that time of night. Not even the sheep were making noise. Then all of a sudden, all the dogs start going nuts over by their truck. And Ed looks over and he sees a man. And this man was unbelievably tall. So tall that he was leaning his arm on the top of the cab of the truck. And he was looking down at the dogs for a few seconds. And then he kicked one of them. And they all scattered in different directions. And then the man looked at Ed. And Ed saw its face. It had a pure white face, like the full moon. 2 burning red eyes and a slight smile that was pure black. Ed couldn't move or make a sound. And the man started to walk toward him in these unbelievably long strides until it was towering right over him. And all Ed began to see was dark blood red. But he kept getting deeper and deeper into the man's eyes. And he could faintly hear his brother coming out of the outhouse. And the thing evidently heard that too, because it turned to look at Ed's brother. And that is when reality came crashing back to Ed. And Ed looked at his brother and noticed that his brother was too preoccupied with his buckle to see what was going on. And he also noticed that this thing had long hands hovering just inches from his head. Its skin was black ash, and it smelled like a dead, bloated animal in summertime. And Ed was unable to move or speak as he watched this thing move closer to his brother. And when his brother finally did notice this thing, he became paralyzed just like Ed was. And as this thing got closer and closer to Ed's brother, something inside of Ed finally snapped, and he just got unbelievably angry. He broke from his trance and lunged at the skinwalker with his arms in the air like a wild animal, baring his teeth at it. And a growl came out of him that he never knew he could make. And he just got angrier and angrier at this thing that was trying to hurt them. And the thing was still smiling at first, but the angrier that Ed got, the more that smile started to fade. And finally, with everything that Ed had in him, he started to make this primal roar that just welled up from deep inside of him. And he roared at this thing, and the thing fell backwards and ran off into the night. But before it disappeared, it took one last glance back at Ed. And Ed could see that its eyes were now glowing very dimly, and it wasn't smiling any longer. And if this episode managed to just whet your appetite, click here for full creepy satisfaction. And we will see you again on the In-Between.